All right, so we're here to celebrate our success with the World Campus and to improve our ability to deliver high-quality online teaching and learning. And our speaker today, Rena Palloff, Dr. Rena Palloff, is an expert and a pioneer in that area. She not only has proven that it can be done, is spending her career, I don't want to make it sound like it's over. Right, she's investing her time in helping all of us do a better job. And she's done that through speaking appearances like this, through by example, and also through extensive prolific publishing. She's a member of the faculty at Fielding Graduate Institute as well as Capella University, and she's the author of 8 different books on online teaching and learning, starting in 1999, pre-Y2K. She was writing books about building learning communities in cyberspace. And in 2001, Lessons from Cyberspace Classroom, The Realities of Online Teaching. 2003, The Virtual Student, A Profile and Guide to Working with Online Learners. 2004, Collaborating Online, Learning Together in Community. It's this idea of learning communities, which I think is one of the big things that higher ed is going to be doing. As more and more content becomes available, what is it people will look to us for? They're going to look to us for community, for creating a place and a group of people and mechanisms through which people can help each other grow, and assessment. So learning community, I think, is really a critical focus. And Dr. Palloff has been in that space for 14 years at least, since her first publishing of her first book. In 2007, Building Online Learning Communities, Effective Strategies for the Virtual Classroom, that's a book that my colleagues and I, working on a project for NASA and National Science Teachers Association, we used that book as we developed NEON, the NASA Educators Online Network. So I've been one of the beneficiaries of Dr. Palloff's work. 2008, Assessing the Online Learner. So assessment, we all know, is critical. Online learning, growing, another great topic for a book. 2011, The Excellent Online Instructor, Strategies for Professional Development. That's what we're here for. And in 2013, Lessons from the Virtual Classroom, The Realities of Online Teaching. So this is someone who has been for a decade helping us become who we are, and here she is today to help us take next steps. With that, I'd like to just add that Rena is also a jewelry maker. She's made the pendant that she's wearing. And with that, I'd like you to give a nice warm welcome for Dr. Rena Palloff, our featured speaker this morning. Rena?
That was quite an introduction. Thank you very much. To date myself even further, going back beyond 1999, I looked up last night when I got here, when was the first time I spoke at Penn State? And it was in 1996 at a distance learning conference that was held right here at the Penn Stater. And it was when my ideas about learning communities were just developing. And I spoke about, the topic that I spoke on at that time was playing in the cyberspace classroom, or sandbox, excuse me, playing in the cyberspace sandbox. Just beginning to formulate ideas about the importance of learning communities and how that sort of drives what we do in the online classroom. So really dating myself. I was 14 at the time, of course. I'm assuming that this is going to advance my slides. Yes. We just heard a bit about the importance of online learning communities and how that sort of informs what goes on in teaching online. There's been a fair amount of research that has happened about online learning communities. Not just mine, but other people have also gotten involved in this whole thing and looked at what is the importance of this. Why do we even care about online learning communities? And what it's telling us, what it's showing us, is that the instructor being a part of that, developing and being a part of that online learning community is really what drives online learning. And I'm going to talk more about that. It's about the intentional development of presence And when you think about some of your online learning experiences, it can be a very isolating, lonely kind of experience if we don't really work to reach out to one another and connect with one another as human beings in this environment. And that's what developing learning communities is really all about. It was mentioned that, this is probably a little difficult to see from the back of the room, but it was mentioned that my work has sort of, on learning communities, has sort of infused a number of different areas of the faculty experience and the learning experience. And so with learning communities sort of in the center of this circle, I've looked at a number of different topics from as was mentioned, assessment and faculty development. I think forming faculty community, and it's wonderful that this is going on for the next couple of days so that all of you can engage with one another in developing a faculty learning community, because that informs the kinds of community that you're going to develop in your classrooms. So staying connected with one another and engaging with one another in this work as a community is also extremely important. I do see a lot more collaboration between faculties as well now, from campus to campus, and a lot of the whole open educational resources kind of movement, I think, is going to be fueled by some of that sense that we need to be working together. And we need to have the resources that we can then implement into our online classrooms that maybe we didn't develop, but somebody else did, and it's good stuff. So we can share that with one another. We can't just assume that when we have a group of learners that we're working with that they're going to know what to do in terms of forming learning communities. I've had numerous students, in fact, when I first entered the whole distance learning arena, I came in saying, I'm not here to engage with other people. I just want to get my degree and get out. And lots of students coming in and saying, the question that I hate the most is, how do I get an A in this class? That's the question I hate to hear. It's because that's not what it's about for me. It's about engagement with one another, and it's about the learning that comes out of that. The learning community becomes the vehicle through which we deliver that educational experience. And so Dee Fink, who I think is marvelous, and talked about 3 aspects to getting students engaged in this whole process. And the first is teaching them to become better learners. And that's where that question of how do I get an A just makes me crazy, because it's really about the learning. And so what I try to do is to work with students around making that shift from it's not about the grade, it's about the learning. It's about teaching them to inquire and construct knowledge. And that, to me, is a collaborative process. Certainly someone can read something and interpret it on their own, but when they engage with another learner or with a group of learners and with the instructor, they are able together to construct knowledge and meaning. And yes, I'm a constructivist and believe very firmly in that it's much more difficult on your own. It's much easier and much more rewarding in community. And then teaching students to become self-directed. I'm thinking about a student a Capella student, as a matter of fact, who I've been engaging with over the last week or so. She's a doctoral learner, and she just keeps coming to me about, what do you want on this assignment? Tell me what you want. Tell me what you want, and I won't tell her. And she gets very, very frustrated with me. But what I'm trying to do is to push her to become more self-directed. And finally, on this last assignment, she reached out to her colleagues for help. And one of her colleagues did engage with her, and she turned in a beautiful assignment. And I congratulated her for taking that initiative to ask for help from her learning community, rather than turning to me and saying, tell me what you want. Because that is not how she's going to make it as a doctoral learner. I mentioned a minute ago the importance of presence. And instructor presence and student presence in the online learning community is really critical. I really focus that you've probably heard about the community of, I'm sure you have, the community of inquiry model that Randy Garrison is famous for. Randy talks about 3 forms of presence, one of which is social presence. I think, and he and I differ on this, he believes that instructor presence is the most important and drives the process. And he and I have had conversations about this. I believe it's social presence, the ability for everyone in the online environment to portray themselves as real people. I think that's what drives the process. And there's been research done, Stein and Wanstreet are a couple of people who have looked at this, as have others, that when presence, not just instructor presence, but when presence is high, you see a highly interactive learning environment. So the more people get a sense that there are real people that they're communicating with in that online environment, you're going to be able to see lots more interaction, lots of active interaction. So when people have asked me, how do I get more participation in my online class? I'm not happy with the level of participation. That's the first place that I go. How are you establishing yourself as a real human being in that environment? I remember an instructor telling me, well, I put up my CV and I did this and I did that. And I said, how many kids do you have? Do you have any pets? Did you tell your students about that? Because it's not about all your academic achievements. All of that is just going to sort of turn students off. It's really about who you are as a person. I talk about my jewelry making. I talk about my dog a lot. I talk about things that make me who I am. And that's how I establish presence in the online environment. And I start that from day one. The way I name things in my course is to try to humanize that environment that can be very sterile and flat. Wenger, what's really interesting is that Wenger was writing about community, excuse me, at the same time that Keith Pratt and I were, and we didn't know each other. We had absolutely no idea that we were both looking at aspects of community building in education. Now, Wenger wasn't necessarily looking at the online environment while we were. But what he talked about, I think the things that he mentioned in 1999, right about the same time that Building Learning Communities in Cyberspace also came out, is that the social aspects of education are the most important. Social aspects are most important, and I think that that's a really key point. Because he also believed that once you address those social issues, those social needs, those social aspects, then education can proceed. And I've always said, and I remember from my own academic experiences as a learner, that what happened in the lecture hall or in the classroom wasn't what was important. It was going for coffee afterwards. It was taking a bathroom break and discussing with the other women in the class what we were just hearing. It was that interaction, that social interaction, that drove the learning. So he said that the value of education is in social participation, and that it is that social identity that drives learning. Those are really, really important points that undergird the whole notion of the learning community. So what we see in terms of some of the research on social presence is that learner satisfaction goes up when they have a sense that they are interacting with real people in the environment. There is a greater depth of learning. We sort of started to have that conversation at the table before I came up here to speak, that when there's that engagement with one another, that the learning outcomes that are achieved are deeper than if that just isn't there. There's also, and this is really important, an increased perception of having learned something. So some of the studies that have gone on have compared online classroom situations where there wasn't a lot of engagement or participation to learning environments where there was a tremendous amount of engagement, active participation. And students were asked, how much do you think you learned? In the classes that were really active and where it was clear that there was presence in those classes, students felt like they learned a lot. In the classes where the interaction was pretty much instructor-driven and where it was a one-to-one kind of situation, they felt like they learned, but not to the degree that the classes where community was built, where they felt how much they felt they learned. And then the main point here is that this builds a sense of community. Establishing presence builds a sense of community. And students feel like they're part of something larger than simply the learning experience. So social presence is not just about discussion and interaction. It's about ways of creating that human-to-human contact. It's using things like icebreaker activities at the beginning of a class. It's about finding ways to engage students with one another through collaborative activity, through all kinds of discussions that go beyond the academic discussions, so that we are engaging as human beings. One of the things that I've started doing in my classes now that our synchronous technologies are much better than they used to be, and bandwidth issues are decreasing, not as bad as they used to be, is making use of voice-to-voice kinds of communication through Skype sessions or virtual classroom sessions, which also helps to create that sense of presence and to connect people with one another voice-to-voice. So any of those kinds of technologies can support that work and help us to build that sense of presence and community. Some of the elements of social presence, again, is that feeling of community and connection, the social context of learning, the interaction and online communication. So the interaction can be anything. It can be that voice-to-voice communication. It can be just a chat session. It can be a discussion in the social area of the course that has nothing to do with the content that's being learned. So it's really about connection in whatever way that can be developed. Again, some of the importance of this is that increased student satisfaction, but also increased persistence. We see lower dropout rates from classes and programs when that sense of community, that sense of presence is there. We promote successful learner-to-learner interaction, which is extremely important in online teaching. We want learners to communicate with one another. That's that that constructivist nature of online learning where it is not necessarily instructor-driven. Gets us to our successful achievement of learning objectives, and most importantly, it reduces that potential isolation, not just for learners, although that's what I have here, but also for the instructor. Because as I said earlier, teaching online can be very lonely. Learning online can be very lonely. And so doing what we can to reduce that sense of isolation and increase that feeling of connection is extremely important. So how do we know when we've been successful at establishing our own presence and helping our students to establish presence? We begin to see more personal forms of address. So I know when students stop referring to me as Dr. Palloff that I've established my presence. They either call me Dr. P or Dr. Rena, or just refer to me by my first name, which is fine with me, and I know I've arrived when that's happened. They begin to acknowledge others in similar kinds of ways. So they are really acknowledging the contributions that others make. Comments like, I always love to read your posts. I really appreciate what you contribute to the learning process. When those kinds of comments come up, or I love your sense of humor, those kinds of things, when those kinds of posts start showing up in an online classroom, you know that presence is there. Expression of feeling. One of the classes that I teach online at Fielding that I love teaching is a group process class, actually. It's group and team development for organizational development students. These are master's level students. And when we get to the point where they're feeling comfortable, and that usually takes a while, where they're feeling comfortable really expressing feeling to one another, I really disagree with you. I really get upset. I got upset when I read this. I strongly disagree. Or, hey, this is really great. I love it, whatever. When we start to see that expression of feeling in the online classroom, then again, we know that people are feeling comfortable with one another as human beings, and we've got online presence happening. The use of humor and social sharing. One of the wonderful things in that same class that I just finished up is that one of the students is Canadian, and she works for Starbucks in Canada. And she got upset with an assignment and found a picture online. I have no idea how she found this thing, but it was a photo of a house, and in the front of the house in the yard were all these forks stuck in the yard. And she started talking about, she was so frustrated with this assignment that she was going to come fork my house. And it was a riot. I mean, everybody was, you could hear the laughter practically of everybody. I don't know where she found this picture, but I was laughing out loud when I saw it. And so that kind of humor is really important. She also just recently went to LA, and a group, I don't know if any of you know this, but a group of employees from Starbucks did a choir. They did a backup choir on The Voice. And so she was in that and made sure that we all got the link to the video so that we could see her performing with her Starbucks group on The Voice, which was very cool. So again, there was a real strong sense of community and connection between those learners, and everybody was so excited to see her in that performance. The other thing that then, and this has become easier as well as we're able to use more graphic representation, but incorporating emoticons and other kinds of graphics into posts is another way that people express that sense of feeling and connection. So that's something that I encourage my learners to do, is to bring in graphics. I teach a lot in Moodle, which makes that very easy because they have a whole lot of emoticons built into the program. So using those, I use them, and I encourage my learners to use them to sort of pepper their posts with feeling, and again, it helps to establish presence. For presence to be able to exist, both instructors and students, first of all, need to be able to carry on an internal dialogue in order to formulate responses. This comes out of the very early research that Keith Pratt and I did around the development of a learning community. And it's a hard thing to describe, but I suspect all of you who are teaching online have experienced it, where you just sort of create this bubble around yourself. You, your computer, and the people you're touching through that computer are forming this little bubble. And you need to be able to do some of that internal processing in order to be able to respond in a measured and thoughtful kind of way. For those of us who are extroverts, that's harder to do. It's very easy for introverts who tend to process internally anyway. I've always said that the online environment is the introvert's paradise. Those of us who are extroverts have to adapt in some ways. And the way that I've adapted, and my family finally has realized that I'm not completely insane, I talk out loud to my computer because I'm an extrovert and I have to process out loud. So I've told students when I've met them afterwards, you have no idea how many conversations I've had with you just talking to my computer. So, but it's a way that I can formulate that dialogue so that then I can respond in a way that makes sense. So again, it's that creation of a semblance of privacy, that I'm in this little bubble with the people with whom I'm interacting. The ability to deal with emotional issues in textual form. Now, again, if we're having voice-to-voice communication, that can be expressed verbally. But in many cases, we're still communicating in text, and so some of that needs to be able to be converted into that format. The ability to create a mental picture of the partner with whom you're communicating. This is part of the reason why I really like to see people post photos or some graphic representation of who they are on a course site, so that I get a sense of who I'm talking to. I hold that picture in my head when I'm communicating with someone online. And I also, through the use of bios and introductions, that helps to form that picture of who I'm communicating with as well. I get a sense of their life, I get a sense of who they are, and that's important. And then personalizing that communication, the ability to not be so formal. Drew mentioned that the tone of this session is conversational for the next 2 days. And that's what I strive to achieve in my online classes as well, is a more conversational kind of tone, rather than I am the instructor and I am lecturing to you. I mentioned Garrison, Anderson, and Archer's work earlier, and Randy Garrison's forms of presence. The other two that he talks about are teaching presence and cognitive presence. He emphasizes teaching presence. As I said earlier, I disagree with him a little bit and feel that social presence is the most important. One of the things where I do agree with him around teaching presence is that teaching presence doesn't necessarily mean it is the instructor who is present. Teaching presence can emerge from members of that learning community, meaning the learners. So that's a very important concept, is that learner-to-learner interaction and allowing and empowering learners to take charge of that learning teaching function. So some techniques. I promised in my little blurb about this to talk about some techniques that help learning communities to form. We need to start the course by focusing on the development of social presence. And we do that through the use of bios, intros, icebreaker activities, all of those kinds of things that help us to get to know one another a little better. And I've had people say to me, but I only have so much time and I have so much material, blah, blah, blah. Incorporate that into the intros and bios and into the icebreaker activities. It doesn't have to be an isolated kind of activity. It should be integrated with the course, but it needs to happen because it will pay off that time that you take at the beginning to focus on the development of community will pay off dramatically towards the end of the course as students engage with one another. Developing presence. I just talked about this, creating a warm, inviting course environment. I do what's called week 0 for those introductory activities. I don't launch right into the content of the course. I spend that first week posting intros and bios, talking about expectations of interaction between one another, doing some icebreaker activities. We might have a synchronous session where we get to know each other voice to voice. And then really encouraging a lot of feedback and high levels of interaction. Establish guidelines for engagement. This is really critically important. It's the what I expect from you and what you can expect from me and what we can expect from one another. And so posting guidelines and sort of rules of engagement at the beginning of the course and asking students to talk about those is really important and begins to form the foundation of a learning community. We want students to be able to engage, and they need to be able to engage with respect. And so the netiquette kinds of guidelines need to be a piece of this, and having them really work with one another around developing group charters, if you will, about how often do we really expect to hear from one another during this course. This is particularly important if your course involves small group collaborative activity, so that there aren't unrealistic expectations that are developed between learners about how they're going to work together. There should be minimal participation guidelines, and there's lots of controversy about this. It's like, do I really expect them to post a particular number of times per week or to engage online a particular number of times per week? And I would say yes. And I haven't had students chafe too badly at this, and I don't think it's demeaning to them to say, I expect you to be online a certain number of times per week, and please don't do it all in one day. Because that's the other little sort of guideline that I throw in there. I don't want people posting everything in one day, coming in, dropping, and leaving. I want them to come back. I want them to see how people have responded to them. I want them to be able to engage. And so developing those kinds of guidelines and expecting students to stick to them is important. And if students aren't sticking to them, if I notice, and I've got one right now who comes in on Sunday, the last day of the discussion, and does everything, and I have to reach out to her and say, this is not acceptable. This is not how we form a learning community. You really need to drop in earlier in the week and then come back. Allow your students to disagree with one another. Encourage them to disagree with one another. All of the good job, good job, good job stuff is really not helpful. And it doesn't help to form a learning community, and it certainly doesn't help to advance the learning. And so there are times where I will post something in a course saying, you know, we're just being a little too nice to one another. It can't be that good. Please get in there and give each other constructive, critical feedback. Disagree. It's okay. We don't obviously want students to get into a disrespectful, flaming kind of posture, but there's a lot of room between disagreement and that. And unfortunately, a lot of us, and you know, I'm not making any judgment here, but a lot of us are really conflict averse, and we get really worried about conflict in the online environment because we can't see it happening so readily, and it's harder to intervene. But it's really important to let students disagree. Healthy disagreement is part of the learning process. Respectful disagreement is part of the learning process. It's important. You need to work on, and I was so glad to see in your program the next couple of days some of the looking at newer technologies and also innovation and all of that kind of thing. It's really important to develop a course that's engaging, it has a lot of variety in it, and that includes collaborative activity. So small group projects, debates, whatever you want to incorporate into your course to make it not just a read and discuss kind of course, but a course that encourages students to work together and thus enhance their learning overall. The benefits of online collaboration, again, it lessens that distance in space and time, promotes more equitable participation, enhances creativity and initiative. I think that's really, really important. I've been doing a lot of work with wiki assignments, and I'm just blown away at the level of creativity that students can bring to that kind of an assignment. Most importantly, it taps into multiple learning styles. If you're just having students post papers or respond to discussions, you're only tapping one learning style. When they engage collaboratively with one another, they are able to use their strengths to support the group. And it also can address issues of culture, which I think gets neglected a lot in the online environment. But when you're working in small groups, we often have students coming from cultures that are highly collaborative. And it supports their ability to work in community because that's what they're used to. We also have students coming from cultures where that is not part of their culture. And we have to be able to work with that as well. So the evidence of the presence of community when you're teaching online, active interaction. And that's not just with the material that you're presenting or the material that they're engaging with, but with one another. Collaborative learning is present. You can see them working with one another, responding to one another. And the interaction is not just student to instructor, it is student to student. Socially constructed meaning. And that is evident when you see them questioning each other with the intent to try to deepen their understanding of what people are talking about. The sharing of resources. I love it when they start, particularly when I'm working with students who are developing projects and someone saying to them, hey, have you seen this article? Have you seen this website? And they're sharing resources with one another to support each other's learning. And those expressions of support and encouragement. We're in this together. We can do this. And when I see that happening in the social area of the course, I'm thrilled. You know, someone will post, I'm feeling overwhelmed. It's the end of the term. I'm taking 3 courses this term. I'm not sure how I can get it all done. And someone else responding, we're here, I'm here, we're here. We can do this together. So to close, this model of community building that we've developed over the years, within that larger circle of community, there are 3 subsets that make that up. And that's people, purpose, and process. The people are, it's evident what the people are. We all come together as people in this learning community. We come together with a common purpose, which is part of what draws us together as community. And then we have a process of engaging with one another through technology to get some work done and to connect with one another. The outcomes of all of that, co-created knowledge and meaning, the ability to reflect and deepen the learning process. We are transformed as learners and as instructors when we engage in online learning communities. There is a transformational process that occurs. And if that happens from course to course to course, again, remember what we're trying to develop is self-directed learners and learners who know how to engage with content and know how to research, know how to critically evaluate the content that they're working with. And that's part of that transformational process that can occur when you're working in a learning community. And then that reinforcement of presence. Once a learner figures out how to establish their presence in one class, that carries over. And they begin to develop that presence in every online situation that they find themselves. So that is all I have. I'm happy to take questions about any of this. Obviously, I'm sort of a preacher for the development of online learning communities, but I have found over the years, as I said when I started, that the online learning community really is the vehicle through which online education is best delivered. And I'm so happy to see that it is sort of infused into your program over the next couple of days, and that it hopefully is the foundation of the work that you're doing online. So thank you very much for having me. Do we have time for a few questions? Yes, sir. That's a great question. And I didn't get into talking about my work on assessment, but that's a terrific question. Even in a learning community environment, you are going to have assessments built into the course that students are going to have to complete individually. I hate grades. I hate assigning grades. I hate it. If it could be a pass-fail world or a credit-no credit world, I would be the happiest instructor alive. But unfortunately, we're not living in that world yet. So we have to build in some individual assessments along the way. So there may be, usually what I try to do are a couple of things. One is I always give some form of a grade for participation. So at midterm and again at the end of the course, I have a rubric that I use for participation. I ask students to self-assess using that rubric and to send me an email telling me how well do you think you're doing in this course based on the rubric and based on your participation. Participation in my classes, usually it weighs pretty heavily. It can be 50 to 60% of the grade, depending on the class. But it always takes a fairly sizable chunk of the assessment. But then again, there are individual assessments. There may be some assignments. I try to make them as authentic as possible. So in other words, taking what we're learning in the class and applying it in some way, and then demonstrating competence with that through those assessments, through those authentic assessments. So for example, one of the assignments that my work at Capella is in the doctorate in social work, and so I'm teaching action research to these students who are completing a doctorate in social work. And so this last week, as a matter of fact, I told them they needed to do a couple of interviews and code those interviews. So they're working with some real data and applying the skills that they're learning about data collection and data coding. So those kinds of things are individual assessments that I will look at, and then they also talk about them in class. So they will talk about the interviews that they conducted with one another, but the assessment of their interview is an individual grade. So it's sort of a combination of the collaborative with individual. Other questions? Yes, sir, in the back.
In marketing, at least in the last 10 years or so, a new concept evolved, which we started seeing consumers as co-producers.
Right.
Then I saw your comment up there in terms of co-created knowledge. Are you referring that some of the student-generated knowledge being part of the course content?
Yes. Thank you for that question. That's an excellent question, and yes, absolutely. I think also we're seeing it in marketing. We're definitely seeing it in other areas as well. With the advent of the newer technologies, mobile technology, for example, other kinds of technologies, students are much more able to be co-producers of content. And so incorporating that into the course absolutely is a way of building community that then supports the knowledge that's generated in that course. For example, having students go out and do little video assignments with using their cell phones, and then bringing that content back into the class is a fabulous way of having them co-produce. The creation of wikis that I was talking about is another way. And oftentimes, some of those products that students have created are so good that I have asked for their permission to use them as content for the next group of students. So yes, definitely co-producers of content as well as knowledge. Thank you. Yes?
Do you or Capella have any metrics on size of teams, duration of team projects, and size of classes for operating learning?
That is a great question, and it has been an area of contention in online learning forever. Fielding and Capella have two different metrics, and I teach for both. Fielding caps online classes at 16, and that's come from mostly faculty input about what we feel optimum class size is in the online environment. And so we were able to have a very strong voice as a faculty and say, we don't want to see really huge classes. Our students don't want to see huge classes. There was also a lot of student feedback that when they got into classes that were larger than 20, let's say, they felt like they were starting to get lost and that there was information overload that was occurring. They couldn't keep up. Instructors couldn't keep up. What I do when I'm teaching a class that's at 20 or above, because Capella caps at 25, they go much higher. And what I see happen at Capella, which I don't see at Fielding when we cap at 16, is I see more attrition in a class of 25 than I will in a class of 16, because students get overwhelmed by those numbers. But what I will always do when numbers are higher is to create smaller learning groups. So subsets of that larger group, so that there isn't one student interacting with 25 or 24 other students, but one student interacting with 6 or 7 other students. So when I create my small groups for a project or something like that, depending on the number of students I'm working with, what I find is if you go below 5, what I found in my own practice, if you go below a small group of 5, it lacks energy. You know, the energy seems to get depleted. There's just not enough momentum in that group to keep things going. So at least 5 seems to be optimal for a small group project. 5 to 7 is probably where I would go for small group work. Pardon?
Project duration? Semester, 2 weeks, 3 weeks?
Depends on the course, depends on the project. The course that I talked about, the group and team development course in the OD program, that's a semester-long project, group project that they work on, and I divide them into groups of 6 or 7, depending on how many I've got in the class. So they're doing small group work together throughout the course, but their large project goes the entire semester. For other classes, I've done 2-week projects. 1 week is a little short to do a collaborative group project because they need time to be able to organize and get their work done. So 2 weeks at a minimum, I would say.
Now I have one.
Okay.
So I too hate grades. But, and I'm a proponent of competency-based kinds of models.
Absolutely.
And competency-based models seem to, in my mind at least, promote the opportunity for rolling enrollments through a course.
Yeah.
So in my vision of where this all might go, I see sort of rolling enrollments where people would come together in smaller, for shorter periods of time around a piece of content, maybe some mastering it, moving on faster than others. Do you have any thoughts about whether or what kinds of community might be developed in a situation like that? Or is that a greater challenge? Is it something where you need to turn up the instructor presence or the teaching presence, or any thoughts on that sort of thing?
That is an excellent question, because I agree with you. That's the direction I see us moving, us being the larger higher education environment. I do see us moving in the direction of more competency-based models where we do have students moving in and out of course situations. I was asked that question actually at Sloan C, because Fielding is looking at developing a competency-based master's program. And someone said to me, with your, being that you are sort of this diehard community advocate, how do you do that in that environment? I think there's 2 ways you can do it. 2 ways to incorporate community. First of all, at the program level, so that as you have students moving through the program, not necessarily a specific course, you can establish a larger community at that program level and really work to keep that active and engaged, where students are supporting one another, because competency-based learning can be extremely isolated and lonely. So trying to get students to connect throughout that program is one way to build community. At the course level, you still can have students supporting one another as they move in and out. So I think if you use your students who are farther along in the process as the people who sort of help to bring in the students who are coming in, knowing that they will be moving in and out. So establishing sort of that guideline, if you will, about how to move through this and how to engage as you are moving through it is important. I taught for a short period of time with a competency-based program that did just that. There was a social space built into those courses with the knowledge that someone who posted something may no longer be in the course, but they're sort of leaving a good idea for the next person. And so that really sort of, again, helps to build. And it was interesting because even though some people were no longer in the course, students coming in would still respond to that person, say, that is such a great idea, I love this, I'm going to incorporate this into my own work. So even though that person wasn't there, that sense of being in something together was still there.
And I think if you combine that with sort of digital badges, if you complete it, so people who master Thing X have a Thing X badge, and in their profile that shows up. So the presence of a profile online with a picture and, you know, favorite quotes and, you know, I have a dog and 3, you know, whatever. And so a combination of the academic and social profile, along with maybe the, like Skype or other online now, so you can see, okay, Rena's online now, and she's already got that badge, and we were in this other thing back here together.
Right.
Boom. So we put all that pieces together.
Absolutely. And that's what I mean about taking it more to the program level as well. So if that's built into the program, not just the individual course, then students can be supporting one another and interacting with one another throughout a competency-based kind of a program.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Questions?
Yes.
Following up on this question on the program, you know, regardless of whether they're taking an online siloed business degree or nursing degree, what type of social and community presence do the students have, the customers have? Are there any examples where they have a bar to hang out at, or you know, a lounge that our face-to-face students do? How do you create that environment for your entire program, just not your course?
Absolutely. And I think that both Fielding and Capella have done a terrific job of doing that. At Fielding, we have a number of community places online where students can interact with one another. We have every school, we have 3 schools at Fielding. We're very small, but we have 3 schools at Fielding: educational leadership, human and organizational development, and psychology. And each of those schools has a community space in our online environment, and students do interact there. So we will, members of the faculty will post things there, students will post things there, they engage with one another in those community spaces. And then we have big university-wide community spaces as well, where students actually get in there and knock around some pretty controversial issues. I'm really amazed at how open those discussions are, and how active those discussions are. Clearly, they're optional. You know, not everybody has to participate at that level, but we get a great deal of participation in those spaces. Capella also has sort of a lot of larger university-wide spaces in which students can interact and support one another. And, you know, we have like a dissertation support group that goes on online, and students can create whatever kinds of sub-communities they want to, both at Fielding and at Capella, in those online spaces. So absolutely, you know, you can sort of take it to a much larger level. Any other questions? It happens. It happens, and you have to be sort of vigilant about that. But one of the other things I find is that when you have done a good job of establishing a trusting community within the group, I've had students contact me and say, you may not have picked this up yet, but so-and-so just posted my idea. or so-and-so just posted exactly what John said, whatever. So I've had students report that to me, that that's happened. I have also picked it up myself. As I've been reading through student posts, and there was really only one time that I picked it up as really blatant plagiarism of another student's ideas and confronted that student directly about that, that they needed to be doing their own work. So it happens. You just have to be very, very aware of it, and you have to be willing to jump in and work with that student who is doing that to make sure they know that that's plagiarism and that it's unacceptable. You can also build it into your guidelines. Remember, I talked about the guidelines being an important foundation at the start of a class, that you can certainly say something about that in your guidelines so that if a student is then doing it, you can go back and say, wait a minute, our guideline is original thought, and that's not original thought. Thank you.